Could you hear it before you saw it? That is how residents of Volgograd later described the early hours before sunrise. First came an unfamiliar sound moving quietly across the night sky. Then, moments later, smoke began rising over one of the city's industrial districts. For many people, the war had always seemed like something unfolding hundreds of kilometers away, far beyond their daily lives. But that morning, the conflict appeared to arrive on their doorstep. By sunrise, source analysts were already examining satellite imagery, local footage, and official statements, attempting to determine exactly what had been struck and why military observers across Europe were suddenly paying close attention. According to Ukrainian officials, the target was the Federal Research and Production Center Titan Barricade, a defense manufacturing complex located in Volgograd. President Volodymyr Zelensky publicly confirmed that Ukrainian forces had conducted a long-range strike against the facility using the domestically developed FP-5 Flamingo cruise missile. While independent assessments of the full extent of the damage continue to evolve, the significance of the reported strike extends far beyond a single industrial site. It illustrates how the conflict is increasingly moving beyond the battlefield and into the industrial networks that sustain modern military power. To understand why this location attracted so much attention, it is necessary to understand what Titan Barricade represents. Its history stretches back more than a century. Originally established during the final years of Imperial Russia, the factory later became known as Red Barricades and eventually developed into one of the Soviet Union's major heavy industrial facilities. During the Battle of Stalingrad in the Second World War, the area surrounding the factory became one of the fiercest battlefields in history. The plant itself was heavily damaged before being rebuilt during the post-war period. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, production declined dramatically, but renewed state defense investment during the 2010s gradually restored the complex to an important position within Russia's military-industrial sector. By the time Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Titan Barricade had become an important of Russia's defense manufacturing system. Publicly available information indicates that the enterprise has been involved in producing equipment associated with several strategic missile and artillery programs. These reportedly include launcher systems supporting the Yar strategic missile complex, components connected to the Iskander operational tactical missile system, and heavy artillery manufacturing. Various reports have also suggested that the facility participates in work related to newer missile development programs, although the precise scope of those activities remains difficult to verify independently. From Ukraine's perspective, facilities like Titan Barricade represent more than individual factories. They form part of the industrial foundation that enables Russia to sustain prolonged military operations. Military campaigns depend not only on soldiers and equipment already deployed, but also on the continuous production of launchers, replacement parts, ammunition, and supporting logistics. Interrupting that industrial cycle has therefore become an increasingly important element of Ukraine's broader strategy. That objective helps explain why the reported weapon used in the strike has attracted so much attention. The FP-5 Flamingo is one of Ukraine's newest domestically developed long-range cruise missiles. Publicly introduced during 2025, the system reportedly combines long operational range with a substantial conventional payload while launching from mobile ground-based platforms. Because it is designed and manufactured inside Ukraine, it also provides Kyiv with a capability that is not dependent on externally supplied systems or foreign authorization for target selection. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Flamingo program is the story behind its development. According to company statements, the project was launched by Firepoint, a Ukrainian defense startup established after the 22 invasion by individuals whose professional backgrounds extended well beyond traditional military engineering. Members of the founding team reportedly came from fields including construction, architecture, software development, and game design, rather than emerging from a large state defense enterprise. The missile reflects a broader trend in which smaller technology-focused companies have become increasingly involved in developing modern military capabilities. Publicly released specifications describe a missile designed for deep strike operations against high value military infrastructure. Firepoint has stated that the system is capable of carrying a large conventional warhead while operating under conditions of electronic interference. Company representatives have also claimed that the missile achieves a relatively high degree of accuracy through multiple navigation methods designed to reduce vulnerability to jamming. Like many modern cruise missiles, the Flamingo reportedly incorporates composite materials intended to reduce its radar signature, although the precise effectiveness of such features cannot be independently confirmed. Equally important is the production model behind the weapon. Compared with sophisticated Western cruise missiles that often cost several $1 million each, Estimates published by defense analysts have suggested that the Flamingo may be considerably less expensive, while still delivering a significantly larger payload than Ukraine's long-ray attack drones. If those estimates are broadly accurate, the missile occupies an important middle ground between inexpensive drones and high-Midas and strategic cruise missiles, potentially giving Ukraine another tool for striking heavily defended military infrastructure. The reported strike on Volgograd also did not occur in isolation. Over recent months, Ukrainian officials have announced a series of long-range operations directed against facilities associated with ammunition storage, explosives manufacturing, missile production, and military logistics. While each individual operation has targeted different locations, many analysts have noted that they appear connected by a common strategic objective: increasing pressure on the industrial systems that support Russia's ability to sustain military operations over an extended period. Within that broader context, Volgograd becomes more than a single location on the map. It represents a shift in how Ukraine appears to be approaching the conflict. Rather than focusing exclusively on battlefield positions near the front lines, increasing attention is being directed toward military production, transportation networks, and defense infrastructure located deep inside Russian territory. Whether this strategy will produce measurable long-term effects remains uncertain, but it clearly reflects an effort to expand the conflict into areas traditionally viewed as secure rear support zones. That larger strategy became even more apparent when Ukrainian officials announced plans for an extended campaign of long-range operations intended to increase military and economic pressure over the coming weeks. Instead of presenting the Volgograd strike as an isolated success, Kai framed it as part of a broader sequence of operations designed to gradually increase the costs of continuing the war. And if that interpretation proves accurate, then the events witnessed over Volgograd before dawn may represent not the conclusion of a single operation, but the opening chapter of a much larger strategic campaign. Ukraine's long-range strike campaign, however, is about more than reaching distant targets. It reflects a broader shift in how modern wars are increasingly fought. Military planners have long understood that defeating an opponent is not always about destroying forces on the battlefield. Sometimes the more decisive contest takes place hundreds of kilometers behind the front line, inside factories, logistics hubs, fuel depots, rail networks, production centers that quietly sustain military operations day after day. Rather than attempting to match Russia shell for shell or missile for missile, Ukraine appears increasingly focused on disrupting the industrial system that keeps those weapons flowing to the battlefield. From that perspective, the strike on Volgograd fits into a much larger pattern. Over recent months, attacks have reportedly targeted ammunition storage facilities, missile component manufacturers, explosives plants, and infrastructure supporting Russia's broader defense industry. While any individual strike may have only a limited immediate impact, military analysts often note that sustained pressure on production capacity can gradually increase costs, slow replacement cycles, complicate logistics, and force an opponent to devote additional resources to homeland defense rather than frontline operations. Whether these cumulative effects will significantly influence the course of the conflict remains an open question, but the strategic logic behind such operations is increasingly visible. History offers several examples of similar approaches. During the Second World War, Allied strategic bombing campaigns attempted to weaken Germany by targeting industrial production and transportation networks, rather than concentrating exclusively on frontline armies. Historians continue to debate the overall effectiveness of those campaigns. German industry demonstrated remarkable resilience for years through dispersal, relocation, and adaptive management. Yet the sustained pressure eventually contributed to growing logistical strain across multiple sectors. One lesson frequently drawn from those experiences is that industrial targeting rarely produces instant battlefield victories. Instead, its effects accumulate slowly through persistent disruption over extended periods. Ukraine's current approach appears consistent with that historical understanding. Rather than presenting any single strike as decisive, Ukrainian officials have increasingly emphasized sustained pressure. Public statements describing an extended campaign suggest an effort to gradually increase the economic, logistical, and psychological costs of continuing the war rather than expecting one operation to fundamentally change the military balance overnight. At the same time, Russia continues to pursue its own objectives along the front. Ukrainian military commanders have acknowledged that Russian offensive operations remain active and that significant fighting continues across multiple sectors. Long-range strikes deep inside Russian territory therefore exist alongside a battlefield where neither side has achieved a decisive breakthrough. This contrast highlights one of the defining characteristics of the conflict's front-phase. Dramatic developments far behind the front lines do not necessarily translate into immediate operational changes where ground combat is taking place. The political dimension adds another layer of complexity. Russian officials have periodically stated that Moscow remains prepared for negotiations under conditions previously discussed during earlier diplomatic contacts. Ukraine, meanwhile, continues to argue that any meaningful negotiations must respect its sovereignty and territorial integrity. As a result, military pressure and diplomatic messaging are unfolding simultaneously. Whether one influences the other remains uncertain, but both appear designed to shape future bargaining positions rather than deliver immediate resolutions. The emergence of the Flamingo missile itself also reflects a broader trend that extends beyond this particular conflict. Across the world, military analysts are watching how relatively small defense companies are increasingly producing capabilities that, until recently, were associated almost exclusively with major aerospace contractors or state defense industries. Advances in commercial manufacturing, digital engineering, composite materials, satellite navigation, and software development have lowered barriers that once made sophisticated long-range strike systems extraordinarily difficult to produce. While governments still provide funding and strategic direction, innovation is increasingly coming from smaller organizations able to move rapidly and adapt to evolving battlefield requirements. If Ukrainian production continues expanding as publicly suggested, the significance extends beyond the number of missiles manufactured each month. Every additional domestically produced long-range system reduces dependence on foreign approval for deep-strike operations, unlike externally supplied weapons that may be accompanied by political restrictions. Indigenous systems provide greater operational flexibility because targeting decisions remain entirely under national control. For military planners, that independence may prove as important as the missile's technical specifications. For Russia, the challenge is not simply intercepting incoming missiles. Every successful strike forces difficult allocation decisions. Air defense assets positioned to protect industrial regions cannot simultaneously reinforce frontline units. Resources devoted to repairing damaged facilities cannot be invested elsewhere. Additional security measures around factories, transportation corridors, and logistics centers inevitably consume manpower and funding. None of these pressures alone is likely to determine the outcome of the conflict, but together they contribute to an increasingly complex strategic environment. This is why analysts have been paying close attention to Volgograd. The reported strike was significant not only because of the facility involved, but because it illustrated how the geography of the conflict continues to evolve. Locations once considered relatively insulated from direct attack are now increasingly discussed as part of the broader military landscape. That shift carries practical implications for force protection, industrial planning, and strategic decision-making on both sides. Even so, caution remains essential when assessing the broader impact. Independent verification of damage inside military production facilities is often limited, and governments on both sides naturally emphasize information that supports their respective narratives. Initial reports frequently evolve as additional evidence becomes available. For that reason, many defense analysts focus less on individual claims and more on observable long-term patterns, including changes in production activity, infrastructure investment, logistics, and operational behavior over time. As the current campaign continues, the central question is no longer whether long-range strikes inside Russia are possible. That question has largely been answered. The more important question is whether sustained attacks against military-industrial infrastructure can meaningfully alter the long-term balance between production, logistics, and battlefield endurance. Modern conflicts are increasingly determined not only by what happens at the front, but also by which side can better sustain the enormous industrial effort required to continue fighting. The smoke that rose over Volgograd may eventually fade, and damaged buildings can be repaired. Yet the broader significance of the strike lies elsewhere. It highlights a conflict that is steadily expanding beyond trenches and front lines into the industrial foundations that support military power itself. Whether that transformation ultimately changes the trajectory of the war remains uncertain. What is clear is that the contest is no longer defined solely by territory captured or lost. It is increasingly becoming a competition over production capacity, technological adaptation, logistical resilience, and the ability of each side to sustain a prolonged conflict under mounting pressure. And that may prove to be one of the defining characteristics of modern warfare, not simply who controls the battlefield today, but who can continue building, supplying, adapting, and enduring long after the headlines have moved on.